Think about your last night. Maybe you watched something, scrolled your phone, read a few pages of a book, had a late snack, talked to someone, fell asleep, probably later than you meant to, woke up in the night at some point, checked the time, went back to sleep. Now strip all of that away. No screens, no electric light, no book, no climate control humming in the background, no lock on your door, no door at all, really. Just you, the people around you, a fire if you were lucky, and the night. Dark, vast, full of sounds you couldn't always identify, stretching on for 10, 12, 14 hours depending on the season. What did you do? This is a question that almost nobody thought to ask seriously until very recently. For most of human history, the night was simply the absence of the day. Historians focused on what people built, conquered, ate, believed. The night, the quiet, dark, unrecorded night, was largely ignored, but a handful of archaeologists, sleep researchers, anthropologists, and historians have started paying attention to it. And what they're finding is equal parts surprising, moving, and deeply strange. Tonight, we're going back, all the way back. Before we can understand what ancient humans did at night, we need to understand something fundamental about what their nights actually felt like. They were dark, genuinely, profoundly, completely dark. This sounds obvious, but it's almost impossible for most modern people to fully appreciate. Even if you live somewhere relatively rural, there is almost certainly ambient light around you. Distant town glow on the horizon, moonlight reflected off roads and rooftops, the standby light on an appliance. We live in a world saturated with artificial light, and it has been that way for long enough that most of us have never experienced true darkness. True darkness, the kind that existed before electricity, is a different experience entirely. On a moonless, cloudy night in the prehistoric world, you could not see your hand in front of your face. You could not see the person next to you. You could not navigate. The world, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist beyond the reach of the fire, and the fire was everything. For our prehistoric ancestors, fire was not a convenience. It was the entire architecture of the night. It provided warmth against temperatures that could kill. It kept predators at bay. Large carnivores, for the most part, avoid fire. It was the only source of light in a world with no other. And crucially, it was the thing that everyone gathered around. The hearth, or whatever rough equivalent existed in a given time and place, was the social center of the ancient world, and it was most powerful, most necessary, and most alive at night. Think about what firelight does to a space. It flickers. It throws dancing shadows across the walls of a cave or a shelter. It makes faces glow and then fall into shadow. It creates a bubble of warm, moving light in the center of total darkness. Researchers who study prehistoric fire use, tracking the distribution of charcoal, burnt bone, and heated stone in archaeological sites, have found evidence of fire going back at least 400,000 years, and at sites like Pinnacle Point on the southern coast of South Africa, we have clear evidence of early Homo sapiens systematically using and maintaining fire around 164,000 years ago. Hearths returned to night after night, season after season. These weren't accidental fires. These were tended, maintained, and socially organized. The night, for ancient humans, began and ended at the fire. Here's the first big surprise, and it genuinely upends something most of us assume without thinking about it. Ancient humans probably didn't sleep the way we do. Most of us think of sleep as a single, solid block of time. You go to bed, you sleep for 7 or 8 hours, you wake up. This is what sleep is supposed to look like. If you wake up in the middle of the night and can't get back to sleep, you probably consider that a problem, maybe even a disorder. But historian Roger E. Kirch, who spent 16 years researching pre-industrial sleep, published a landmark study in 2001 that revealed something remarkable. In hundreds of historical documents, diaries, court records, medical texts, literature from medieval and early modern Europe, references to a first sleep and a second sleep appear constantly. People would go to sleep shortly after dark. They would sleep for roughly 4 hours. Then they would wake up, naturally, not due to disturbance, for a period of 1 to 2 hours, and then they would sleep again until morning. That middle period, sometimes called the watch or the wakeful hour, was not considered a problem. It was considered normal, expected, even useful. What did people do during it? According to Ekirch's research, they talked with their partners or family members. They prayed. They lay quietly and thought. They got up and tended the fire. Some people used the time to visit neighbors. Some interpreted their dreams, which, waking fresh from the first sleep, they remembered with unusual clarity. Some simply lay awake in a state of quiet, calm rest. Not fully asleep, not fully awake. Here's where it gets interesting, though, and where we need to be careful about assumptions. For a long time, people assumed this segmented sleep pattern must be the deep ancestral default, that if literate medieval Europeans slept this way, surely prehistoric hunter-gatherers must have too. But in 2015, sleep researcher Jerome Siegel at UCLA put that assumption directly to the test. His team tracked the actual sleep patterns of 94 individuals across 3 traditional hunter-gatherer societies: the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Tsimane of Bolivia, societies with no electricity and no artificial light, living much as their ancestors had for thousands of years. And what they found was not segmented sleep. What they found was a single, consolidated sleep block, averaging between 5.7 and 7.1 hours. No wakeful hour. No first and second sleep. One solid stretch, heavily influenced by temperature. People tended to fall asleep a few hours after sunset and wake naturally as the morning chill set in before dawn. So, the picture is more nuanced than it first appeared. Segmented sleep seems to be a pattern that emerged in agricultural and early modern European societies, likely influenced by the particular rhythm of long winter nights, indoor heating, and the cultural habit of going to bed early. For our deeper prehistoric ancestors, sleep was probably simpler. One block, shorter than we might expect, and tightly tied to the temperature of the night. What was consistent, however, across both worlds, medieval Europe and the prehistoric savannah, was what happened in the hours before sleep. The time around the fire, the social hours of the early night, after dark, but well before anyone lay down. Those hours were rich, deliberate, and anything but empty. So, let's go back as far as we can. The hunter-gatherer world. The Paleolithic. People living in small bands of 20 to 50 individuals, moving with the seasons, sheltering in caves or temporary structures, hunting and foraging by day and gathering around the fire by night. What do we actually know about what happened in those hours? Some of our best evidence comes not from archaeology but from anthropology, specifically from studies of modern hunter-gatherer communities that have maintained traditional lifestyles into the 20th and 21st centuries. Groups like the Kungsan of the Kalahari, the Hadza of Tanzania, and the Agta of the Philippines have been studied extensively, and while we cannot assume their lives perfectly mirror those of our prehistoric ancestors, they offer the closest living window we have. And what researchers found, consistently, was that the night around the fire was not downtime. It was, in many ways, the most important social time of the day. Anthropologist Polly Weissner published a study in 2014 comparing the conversations of the Kungsan during the day versus around the fire at night. The difference was stark. Daytime conversations were primarily practical. Who is going where to hunt? What was found? Conflicts and complaints. Economic matters. Functional talk. But the nighttime conversations around the fire were almost entirely different in character. They were filled with stories. Not just any stories. Stories about people who were not present. Stories about distant places. Stories about the past and the future and the imagined. And most powerfully, stories about the supernatural. About spirits, ancestors, gods, forces beyond the visible world. Weissner's conclusion was striking. She argued that firelight, specifically firelight, with its flickering shadows and its particular effect on the human face, created a different cognitive and emotional state than daylight. One more conducive to imagination, empathy, and the projection of inner lives onto the world. The campfire, she suggested, was not just where ancient people gathered for warmth. It may have been where something essential about human consciousness was built and maintained, where theory of mind developed, where the capacity to imagine other people's inner lives was exercised and strengthened night after night for tens of thousands of years. The stories told around those prehistoric fires are gone, but the capacity for storytelling, the human compulsion to narrate, to imagine, to share the contents of our minds with one another, that's still with us. And it may have been forged, in large part, in the dark. Now here's something that should stop you in your tracks. Much of the greatest prehistoric art ever created, the cave paintings of Lascaux in France, of Altamira in Spain, of Chauvet, of dozens of other sites across Europe and beyond, was made in complete darkness. These caves are not close to the entrance, where daylight might filter in. The paintings at Lascaux are hundreds of meters inside the cave system. The Hall of the Bulls, the most famous chamber, is so deep inside the earth that no natural light has ever touched it since the cave was sealed around 17,000 years ago. The people who painted those animals, the horses, the aurochs, the bison, the lions, were working by firelight. Small stone lamps, some of which have been found at the sites, burned animal fat and produced a small flickering flame. And they painted deep inside the earth, in chambers that must have been profoundly strange environments to exist in, enclosed, echoing, flickering with shadows, far from the world outside. Why there? Why not paint in the daylight, in the open air? Researchers have proposed a number of theories. Some believe the caves were sacred spaces, that the act of painting there was a ritual, not a casual creative act. Some researchers have noted that many of the painted chambers have unusual acoustic properties. They echo and resonate in distinctive ways, which may have made them feel charged with supernatural significance. Some have suggested the flickering of the lamps and the texture of the cave walls may have given the painted animals a sense of movement, that in the dancing light, the bison seemed to run. In 2021, a team of researchers from Tel Aviv University published a study in the journal Time and Mind that proposed a remarkable answer to this question, one that reframes the entire experience of cave painting. They simulated what happens to oxygen levels inside enclosed cave chambers when you light torches and fat lamps. The results were striking. In the narrow passages and isolated chambers where so much of the art was found, oxygen levels dropped quickly, well below the 18% threshold at which hypoxia begins to affect the human brain. And hypoxia, it turns out, triggers the release of dopamine, producing hallucinations, out-of-body experiences, and a profound sense of floating or flying. In other words, the act of bringing fire into those deep, airless chambers didn't just light the walls, it altered the minds of the people painting them. The flickering shadows and the animal forms emerging from the uneven rock surface were being perceived by people in a genuinely altered state of consciousness. Dizzy, euphoric, seeing things that weren't quite there, in a space that felt charged with something beyond the ordinary world. These weren't just artists decorating walls. They were, in all likelihood, conducting rituals, deliberately seeking out the transformative darkness of the deep cave, knowing on some level that what waited inside was not just stone, but a threshold. Whatever the full truth of it, these people chose to go deep into the earth, in the dark, with small handheld fires, and create images that have survived for tens of thousands of years. That is not a casual decision. The night, the dark, and what lay beyond ordinary waking consciousness, these things were sacred to them in a way that left marks we can still see today. We should also be honest about something. The ancient night was not just a place of storytelling and art and quiet wonder. It was also frightening, genuinely, practically, lethally frightening. In the prehistoric world, the dark was where the predators were. Lions, leopards, hyenas, wolves. Most large predators are crepuscular or nocturnal, meaning they are most active at dusk and through the night. For early humans on the African savanna, sitting in the dark without fire was not a philosophical experience. It was a survival risk. The fear of the dark is one of the most universal human experiences across cultures and history, and there's a strong evolutionary argument that this is not coincidence, that the humans who were more cautious about darkness, who stayed close to the fire, who woke at unfamiliar sounds in the night, were simply more likely to survive long enough to have children. We may have inherited the night fear of our ancestors, not metaphorically, but literally. This fear shaped behavior in deep ways. It kept groups together. It made fire tending a communal priority. It incentivized the building of shelters, the posting of watches, the development of social structures that made the night survivable. Some researchers have suggested that the experience of darkness, and of surviving it, may also be part of why humans across virtually every culture developed concepts of night-related supernatural beings, monsters, spirits, things that moved in the dark, creatures that came when the fire went low. The night was real, the danger was real, and the imagination, supercharged by firelight and darkness and the sounds of the world outside, filled in the gaps with something that made narrative sense of the threat, even if that something was not entirely real. Let's move forward in time, into the earliest civilizations, and start with Egypt, because the Egyptians thought about the night in a way that was extraordinarily systematic. For the ancient Egyptians, the night was not just the absence of the sun. It was a place the sun went to, a journey, a passage, a battle fought and won every single night so that morning could arrive. The sun god Ra was believed to travel through the Duat, the underworld, during the 12 hours of night. Each hour was a region, guarded by different beings, filled with different challenges. Ra's solar bark moved through them, escorted by other gods, fighting the serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos, in the deepest hour before dawn. If Ra lost that battle, the sun would not rise. Every morning was, in a very real theological sense, a victory. This was not just mythology in the abstract sense. It shaped how Egyptians experienced the night. Priests kept vigil in temples through the dark hours, performing rituals designed to support Ra on his journey. Prayers were timed to the hours of the night. Temple ceilings in the Valley of the Kings are covered in astronomical charts, star clocks used to track the hours of darkness by the rising of specific stars. The Egyptians invented one of the earliest known systems for measuring the time at night. They identified 36 groups of stars, called decans, each of which rose on the eastern horizon at 10-day intervals. By tracking which decan was rising, a priest or astronomer could tell the approximate hour of the night with reasonable accuracy. There's a fascinating wrinkle here worth pausing on. The Egyptians divided the actual period of darkness into 12 equal hours, but that period itself varied with the seasons. A summer night was shorter, so a summer night hour was genuinely shorter than a winter night hour. Time was not the fixed 60-minute unit we take for granted. It was elastic, stretching and contracting with the darkness itself. The Egyptians didn't impose a rigid clock onto the night. They bent time to fit it. This is remarkable. These people cared enough about structuring the night, about knowing where in the darkness they were, that they built an entire system of stellar timekeeping to navigate it. The night, to the Egyptians, was not empty. It was busy, dangerous, sacred, and precisely measured. Now to the Greeks and Romans, and this is where things get delightfully, recognizably human. Because in ancient Greece and Rome, the night was, at least for certain classes of people in certain contexts, a time to have fun. The Greek symposium was a drinking gathering, typically held in the evening and continuing well into the night. Men, and it was almost always men, would recline on couches, drink wine mixed with water, and spend the night in philosophical debate, poetry, music, and conversation. The symposium was the intellectual and social engine of Greek civic life. Major ideas were debated there. Poetry was composed and performed there. Political alliances were formed there. And it happened at night by lamplight, specifically because the night, freed from the obligations of work and public life, was considered the proper time for this kind of elevated leisure. The Romans took nightlife in a somewhat different direction. Roman cities were extraordinarily loud and busy at night, for a counterintuitive reason. Many Roman cities banned wheeled vehicles from the streets during daylight hours to manage congestion. So merchants, tradespeople, and supply carts all moved through the city at night. The Roman night was full of the sound of carts, deliveries, and street commerce. At the same time, Roman banquets, the cena, often extended well into the evening. Elite Romans ate their main meal in the late afternoon and continued into the night with food, wine, entertainment, and conversation. Roman poets wrote about the particular quality of nighttime, its freedoms, its intimacy, its slightly transgressive energy. The Roman poet Ovid, writing around the turn of the first millennium, essentially wrote a guide to conducting love affairs at night, navigating the city in darkness, the particular mood of a lamplit room, the experience of the hours before dawn. But not everyone found the Roman night romantic. The satirist Juvenal had a very different take. Writing in the early 2nd century, he complained bitterly about the noise of the city after dark. In his satires, he wrote that the endless traffic of wagons grinding through narrow, winding streets and the shouting of the drivers when they got stuck would deprive even the deepest sleeper of rest. His conclusion was blunt. Insomnia causes more deaths among invalids in Rome than any other cause. Only the wealthy, he noted, could afford homes quiet enough to actually sleep in. For everyone else, the Roman night was relentlessly, exhaustingly loud. 2,000 years before anyone had a word for noise pollution, Rome had already invented the problem. The night, in the classical world, was not simply a gap between days. It had its own texture, its own rules, its own social life, and depending on where you lived and how much money you had, it was either a space of pleasure and connection or one of sleepless, cart-rattled misery. Across all of these cultures, prehistoric, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, there is one thread that runs consistently through how humans related to the night. Dreams. Every ancient culture, we have significant records of treated dreams as meaningful, not as the random noise of a sleeping brain, but as messages from gods, from ancestors, from the deeper layers of reality that were not accessible in waking life. The Egyptians had professional dream interpreters. Papyrus scrolls containing dream dictionaries have survived, texts that catalogue different dream scenarios and their meanings. Temples were built specifically for the purpose of incubation, the practice of sleeping within a sacred space in the hope of receiving a divine dream. Sick people would travel to the Temple of Sekhmet, or later to the Greek Temple of Asclepius, perform purification rituals, and then sleep there, hoping that the god would appear in their dreams and reveal a cure. The Greeks formalized this into a whole practice. The Asclepion at Epidaurus was a healing center built around the idea that the god Asclepius would visit patients in their sleep and provide medical guidance. People came from across the ancient world to sleep there. Hundreds of inscriptions survive describing the dreams people received and the healings that followed. The Romans took dreams seriously enough to consider them worthy of political attention. Generals and emperors sought dream interpretation before major decisions. The Senate received reports of significant dreams as a matter of public record. Julius Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, dreamed of his death the night before the Ides of March. And further back, in the prehistoric world, though we cannot read their dreams, we have indirect evidence that the night and the dream world were treated with sacred weight. The cave paintings, made in the dark, in altered states of consciousness produced by heat and smoke, and the sensory strangeness of deep cave environments, may reflect a belief in another layer of reality accessible through the dreamlike state. For ancient humans across tens of thousands of years, the night was not just where the body rested. It was where the mind touched something beyond itself. Here is where I want to bring it home. The electric light bulb was commercially viable by the 1880s. Within a few generations, the ancient relationship between humans and the night, the relationship that had shaped us for hundreds of thousands of years, was fundamentally altered. The night became available, defeatable, something to be pushed back with the flick of a switch. And we lost some things that we don't often talk about. We lost the dark sky. For most of human history, the night sky was one of the defining features of human experience, a canopy of stars so dense and bright that the Milky Way cast a visible shadow. The gods lived up there. The stories lived up there. The Egyptians mapped their sacred buildings to align with stars. The Greeks named constellations after heroes and monsters. And ordinary people, every night of their lives, looked up at it. Today, roughly a third of the world's population cannot see the Milky Way from where they live because of light pollution. The sky that was the backdrop to every human life for hundreds of thousands of years is simply gone for most of us. We also lost the rhythm of the early night, the hours between dark and sleep that hunter-gatherers used for conversation, storytelling, music, and connection. That wasn't sleep time. It was the richest social time of the day, and we filled it with screens instead. And we lost a certain quality of attention that darkness produces, the particular state that firelight and true night create, the inward focus, the heightened imagination, the sense of a world contracted to the people immediately around you, is genuinely hard to access in a world of screens and electric light. We've traded it, largely willingly, for enormous practical benefits. But it was a trade. What ancient humans did at night, at its core, was this. They gathered. They told stories. They slept in ways that matched the darkness rather than fought it. They dreamed and took those dreams seriously. They built whole cosmologies around the experience of night, whole religions, whole sciences, whole bodies of art. They did, in the dark, what we still fundamentally need to do: connect with each other, make meaning, and find some way to hold the fear at bay until the morning came. The fire is different now, but we're still gathered around it.